Alrighty, welcome back to Performance Programming Simplified. We're on episode 4 now. This is going to be energy systems. Initially, when I was developing this and doing the slides, I'd put a bunch of information in there on how the energy systems worked on a physiological kind of framework, and realized that was more like performance programming complicated. And so we're going to keep it simple for the first episode, kind of checking our boxes for the three main things that are required for the sport of functional fitness. And so we'll go over the general application of our framework and how it relates to energy systems training and what energy systems training is. And then in future episodes, I will go more in depth on how to train certain aspects of your engine. Okay. So if I can get this going here. So what are the energy systems? You've got your phosphocreatine system, your glycolytic system, your oxidative system. So in general, there are three main energy systems, and you've probably seen something like this before. Like CrossFit really popularized a graph, I think, at one point, where they're like, if the time domain is between 0 and 5 seconds, you're training your phosphocreatine system. You're using the fuel source as phosphocreatine. If it's anywhere from 2 minutes to 4 hours, I think CrossFit will keep that a little bit shorter. They're like, if it's between 2 and 6 minutes, it's glycolytic and you're using carbohydrates. And then anything past that duration, you're using fats. But that is wrong. That is not necessarily how things work. Okay. So to provide some clarity, your energy systems all work together. Okay. And so a loose analogy that you can use is that your energy systems work like a hybrid car. You might have a Prius. You also might have a supercar. It's really just depends on how fit you are. But in general, the energy systems all work at the same time. Okay, and so while it is true that the phosphocreatine system uses phosphocreatine, and it is biased when you are doing more intense work. And then, your glycolytic system kind of carries you through that mid range with the intensity. All of the energy systems are working at the same time. Okay. And so you don't choose your energy system that you're going to work. You don't, say, hey, I'm going to go do rowing sprints today, and I will only use my phosphocreatine system. It's like, that's not how it works. You'll also be metabolizing carbohydrate, and you'll also be using fat as well, just to a lesser extent. And so when we look at like an example for this, if we were to use running a mile as an example, or maybe a better example here would be like running a marathon, you're going to start, and the initial like steps that you take will use the phosphocreatine system, because it is what will provide the quickest source of energy for your muscles to perform their contractions. So you want to get going, you take a couple steps, those contractions happen, and your body's like, let's just use the phosphocreatine really quick to kind of like replenish, make sure that they're good to go. And then as that's happening, you're also mobilizing glycogen from the liver so that you have, some backup fuel stores in case you're, done after or in case you're not done after you finish your couple steps that you took using the phosphocreatine system. And at the same time, you'll be mobilizing fat stores as well. The problem is that each of those metabolic processes happen relatively slower, right? So the phosphocreatine system is really quick. It just takes a long time for it to replenish and be ready to go again. The glycolytic system can mobilize glycogen relatively fast, not as fast as phosphocreatine can give you energy, but it can do a good job of getting things going for you. And then the fat just takes a lot longer to get into the system, like to turn into ATP basically, and turn into usable energy for the muscles to contract. Now, the reason that they're all kind of like working together is because your body doesn't really know, even though you know what the workout is, your body doesn't, right? And so it's going to kind of push and pull from all these different like metabolic processes to support the exercise and the intensity that you're bringing. And your body wants to do whatever is most efficient. Okay, so your body is really good at only doing as much as it needs to complete a certain task. And so when you start going, you get up and running. It's like, let's say you're going to do some zone 2. You'll mobilize glycogen. You'll use phosphocreatine at the beginning, but once it realizes that there's a more efficient way for me to be producing energy, and this athlete's going to be like, the body's going to be fine, the system's going to be fine if we just rely on fat for this, then it'll bias that for sure. It's not going to be mobilizing glycogen. It's not going to be biasing towards that phosphocreatine system, but all of those things are still working at the same time. It's just it'll preferentially use whatever will meet the demands of the sport or the task with the least amount of energy. And so if it's low intensity cardio, fat is gonna be sufficient to give you the energy to complete the task, and it takes the least amount of like energy to produce that, right? And then so on and so forth. Okay. So, in kind of regards to the sport, since we've done this with the other, gymnastics, we went over about how many of the movements you're going to need to be able to do. With the weightlifting, we went over weightlifting standards. For the aerobic standards, it's going to be a little bit more of a spectrum, because oftentimes these are grouped in with other events, right? And so you might have rowing and running, or skiing or whatever mixed in with other modalities, which makes it hard to quantify what like a specific good score is. The 5K has become popular recently. There have been they typically do one or two events either at the games or at these bigger in-person competitions that are more or less just one modality, or maybe two put together. So there's some data there, but it's not quite as concrete as the other data that we're seeing for like gymnastics and weightlifting. So in general, I would say if you want to be a competitive CrossFit or functional fitness athlete, you want to be like coming towards that elite level, you need to be going sub 620 on a 2K, which is a 135 split for 500, and women probably sub 710, which I think is 142.5 is the average split for the per 500. And this would be like you do a 2K test and that's it, right? Not like mid workout or whatever. Probably the best in the sport are going 610, and for the woman probably sub 7. And I would say that at the very least, everyone at the CrossFit Games is able to go sub 635 for the guys and sub 720 for the ladies. The reason that these like upper end get harder to hit is because on machines specifically, the effort and the wattage scale exponentially. So the difference between 620 and 610 on a rowing machine is pretty significant. Whereas like the difference between 610 and 635 it's a little bit, I'll say it's easier to get from 635 to get to 610 than it is to get from, it's easier to get from 635 to 620 than it is to get from 620 to 610, right? And the same thing for the women's speeds respectively. And then for the 5K, I'm thinking that like 18 minutes is going to be a competitive time in the next couple of years for the 5K, at least for the top end dudes. And then probably closer to 19 for the ladies. The only reason that I say that is because the girls tend to be a little bit more short and stout compared to the men. Recently, for whatever reason, the men have been a little bit taller, which lends itself well to running, especially at this distance. The women have not, they're typically just a little bit stronger and more stout compared to the men, so that they can like handle the loads, and therefore with their, with the amount of muscle mass that's required for them to compete in like literally every other event except for the 5K, and then the fact that they're probably a little bit shorter, it just makes it hard from a biomechanics standpoint to get the 5K time super low, right? Like they just, for them to get any more competitive in the 5K, they would need to get skinnier and probably be a little bit taller. And if that's the case, then they're definitely like, it's not worth the trade-off for them compared to the other events that they need to be good at. So, when we're looking across the board between men and women, when we're looking at like elite 5K runners versus the 5K runners that we see here, it's like they're way smaller. Like it is significant. As someone who's lost weight before will understand this. Like running gets significantly easier the lighter you are. So like it's just a fun like that. I don't think that the 5K is gonna get much faster than that given the demands of the rest of the sport. But I'm happy to be proved wrong. But I think that it would be it's going to get exponentially harder to go any faster than what we're at now for the 5K, just based on the demands of the sport and what all of the other events are selecting for in terms of anthropometrics. So we've gone over this framework before in the past, and we're going to just look at how we can apply this framework to our, energy systems training. And so before we do that, movement selection is something that we should go over because there's kind of a bunch of different modalities that we can use to train energy systems. They are almost always cyclical in nature and relatively have relatively low technical standards that you need to hit and efficiency standards that you need to hit, which means basically like a lot of people can do them, and there is a really big spectrum of how fast you can go, right? And so almost everyone can hop on a Concept 2 bike or an Echo bike and start pedaling, right? What matters is how fast you go, okay? And so for that reason, there's kind of a lot of options, and it can get a little bit complicated for folks when you're kind of getting to the nitty gritty and trying to see what's going on with this. So when we're looking at overall fatigue, from least systemic fatigue to most systemic fatigue, the least fatiguing is going to be walking. Concept 2 bike is also not super fatiguing. The Echo bike is, although people find it uncomfortable and have a very negative association with the Echo bike, it is not the most systemically fatiguing piece of equipment. Has little to no eccentric loading involved, and so the nature of the contraction is actually pretty repeatable, which is a reason that it is so uncomfortable, is because it is easy to make it harder. Swimming is relatively low systemic fatigue, although if you are new or bad at swimming, it can be very neurally fatiguing. So a lot of times people describe swimming as it feels good for my body, it feels really fatiguing and tiring for my brain. To an extent, you have to think like you're doing an exercise that your body doesn't know it thinks you're drowning for an hour straight. So like, of course it's going to be a little bit freaked out by that. But it's just something to note that it can cause people to feel tired after, even though it is a relatively low impact form of exercise, form of cyclical training. Rowing becomes a little bit more fatiguing. It has some eccentric loading. There's a dampening effect that happens when you compress into the front of the stroke, and it uses more muscle groups. You're using a lot of lat, you're using a lot of hip and quad extension, so it will kind of induce a little bit more fatigue. The ski is pretty fatiguing. There is at the front of the stroke, or the top of the stroke, I should say, right when you when you get tension on the handle at the very top and you start to throw the hips back and lean forward, you end up creating a small amount of eccentric load through the tricep, the lat, and the anterior chain in the core. And so for that reason, folks will tend to get pretty sore after they ski, especially if they haven't skied for a long time. Really kind of in the tricep, in the long head of the tricep, and the lat here in the armpit, basically, tends to create a lot of fatigue for people. So in terms of its eccentric load and just the amount of tissue damage that it can cause, I would say that it is more systemically fatiguing than some of these other modalities. And then running is going to be the most fatiguing. It's pretty high impact. There's eccentric contractions happening every single, step that you take. And so that will just lend itself to the most amount of fatigue of all of these different movements. All right. In terms of peripheral fatigue, goes into a little bit more program design stuff, but like when we're looking at peripheral fatigue, it can help us choose what movements we want to balance or pair things with, whether you're looking for complementary or non-complementary interference. You can decide based on the program that you're designing, but walking will have pretty much no peripheral fatigue. It's relatively easy, especially for those of you that are at all interested in this podcast. The Concept 2 bike has a significant amount of quad interference. If you've ever done something that is a really heavy quad workout and you use the Concept 2 bike, it is quite uncomfortable. So that is something to be aware of, although other than that, it is relatively easy compared to the other cyclical modalities. The Echo bike uses the quads as well, but it also uses some of the pressing and pulling muscle groups. So if you're pairing an Echo bike with something like handstand push-ups, there will be some form of interference there with pressing the handles away from you, although I don't think that amount of tension is super significant and oftentimes doesn't really present itself as a huge issue for people. Swimming is going to kind of cause some interference with pulling and pressing. A lot of times athletes are just doing swim workouts solo, so this one's kind of a funky one again because most people aren't doing like swim into barbell thruster and bar muscle up. If that were the case, then there would probably be more consideration around this, but it's just important to know, I guess, if you're going and doing a swim workout and then you've got stuff planned later in the day. For rowing, I find that it is most interfering with pulling movements. If you're doing a bunch of bar muscle ups and you pair it with hard rowing, it'll make the bar muscle ups harder. Hip flexion can be challenging also. So we've seen this before as in the form of like rowing paired with GHDs, rowing paired with V-ups. That makes the rowing significantly harder, makes the other movement significantly harder. It's fatiguing for the quads and it's fatiguing for hip extension. I do think that it's more taxing on the quads. That terminal knee extension that you get and the lockout at the back end of the stroke is going to make things like thrusters and even goblet squats harder relative to how the row will affect your ability to do deadlifts just by the nature of the size of the muscle groups involved and the fact that like people can just deadlift more weight. And so it just doesn't interfere quite as much with like cleans and snatches and deadlifts as it does with something like a thruster. And I might be biased there. It might be my personal experience with the rowing machine, but I think that people tend to tolerate the mixture of rowing and bending with like external load better than they tolerate the mixture of rowing and squatting. Skiing is really going to fatigue pressing. It'll fatigue your pulling and it'll fatigue hip flexion, so your ability to close the core off. And then running is going to probably fatigue bending the most, but it's running is really, really good at creating systemic fatigue. Peripheral fatigue usually actually isn't a huge problem. Like people can go for a run relatively fast, get back in and start doing something like wall balls or thrusters. They won't say, I got back from the run and I felt like my quads were screaming. They'll get back from the run and say, I felt like I couldn't catch my breath, right? So that's what it's better for general fatigue, okay? You're just going to kind of pick these based on like what you're trying to target. So when we're looking at mobility and strength, applying this to our framework, now that we've picked movements or whatever, and we're applying it to this framework of, progressing our framework through mobility and strength, volume, movement economy, and then repetition and stress. The mobility and strength requirements for cyclical movements is extremely low. Basically, the better mobility that you have, the more efficient you'll be able to be. So if you can get yourself into more, like technical positions in the rowing or the ski or even with running, you'll move more economically And if that's the case, then you'll, be able to sustain more power with less of a fatigue cost. So that's kind of where mobility and strength comes in. Really, like I said earlier, everyone's going to be able to take strokes on the rowing machine. Everyone's going to be able to take a couple steps of walking or jogging. So it's like those strength requirements aren't really as much of a consideration as they would be for something like a muscle up or a pistol squat. Okay, so for movement economy and volume, basically, like I said earlier, technical proficiency is going to allow you to do more work with less fatigue cost, right? And so if you have really great running economy, really great rowing economy, you can produce more power and sustain power for much longer compared to your competitors, right? And this is the volume, right? So online qualifiers, you're looking at needing to be able to row about 5 kilometers in a single workout, running maybe 2 miles for an online qualifier, or like kind of regional competition. And then at the games, the 5K of running is probably the most that you'll need to do, or rowing, sorry, and running both should just be able to do about 5K. They'll have an event. I know people would say like they had the marathon row, but yeah, sure, I guess. I don't think that it's worth your time training anything more than 5K of rowing or 5K of running in terms of its total volume in a training session. Okay, and then repetition and stress, we're just looking at using intervals to expose ourselves to race pace. You don't have to do the same type of work rate build that you would for things where there's like fixed weights and fixed movement speeds. With this one, it's a little bit more about developing pace, and so there's different ways that you can approach that, and I'll go into that in future episodes. This is just a brief overview. So go ahead and like, comment, subscribe, follow me on Instagram, message me if you have any questions, and yeah, hopefully this was helpful, and we'll go over more in depth on different energy systems and how they work and how to train each specific energy system in the future.